On the 10th day of the deep freeze, the only place left in the city with heat was our apartment building. The warmth and survival of over 200 people here were all in one man's hands. Everyone saw him as their savior. Only I knew that the hand smilingly handing out rations was quietly deciding who would survive the winter. My name is Tian Bula. I live on the 12th floor of Donghua Garden. The deep freeze arrived 10 days ago. Without any warning, overnight, the temperature plunged to minus 40 degrees. Most of the power grid went down. The whole city seemed to have been sealed in ice. Outside, everything was white. There wasn't a soul left on the streets. Our building survived because of an independent heating system in the basement. Donghua Garden was a luxury complex built over a decade ago. It came equipped with a complete underground heat source and emergency supply reserves. When the deep freeze hit, heat flowed through the pipes into every apartment. Our building became the only place for miles that still had warmth. And the man controlling this lifeline was Mao Bufan. Before the disaster, he was Donghua Garden's property manager. He knew the building's water, power, and access systems, and exactly who lived in every apartment. So, on the second day of the freeze, he was the first one into the basement, and naturally took control of the heat and supplies. He had managed the building before all this, so no one thought anything was wrong. He set rules in the lobby. All supplies had to be registered together and distributed centrally. Rations were issued by card. Anyone who tried to grab extra would lose their right to receive supplies. In a disaster, having someone who could keep order and keep the heating running was exactly what everyone wanted. In just a few days, Mao Bufan went from property manager to the ruler of the whole building. I admit he was capable. He kept the lobby running like clockwork, and more than 200 people stayed under control. Every evening when rations were handed out, he stood in the middle of the lobby and personally passed food to each resident. With a smile, he'd say, "Make it last. We'll be fine once we get through this." The elderly and the children all praised him. But me? Before the disaster, I trained people in emergency management. For 7 years, I taught people how to survive crises. That job left me with one habit I could never shake: doing the math. And I did the math on this building's supplies. For a complex like Donghua Garden, based on the standards from when it was built, the emergency reserves in the basement should have supported 200 people for at least 2 years. But Mao Bufan claimed there was only enough for 20 days. He rationed everything based on those 20 days, releasing supplies little by little, until everyone believed resources were scarce and depended on him to stretch every portion. 20 days versus 2 years. Where did the missing supplies go? I kept that question to myself for days, and told no one. Then, on the 10th day, something happened. That evening, during ration distribution, old Joe was in line ahead of me. He lived on the 16th floor, was in his 70s, and lived alone. When he received his ration, he casually asked, "Xiao Mao?" The portions keep getting smaller every day. How much is actually left in the basement? We'd all feel better knowing. It was an ordinary question. Mao Bufan's smile never changed. He handed over the ration and said gently, "Uncle Joe, I know exactly how much we have. Don't worry." Old Joe took his ration and left. I thought that was the end of it. But early the next morning, on the registration sheet in the lobby, old Joe's ration eligibility had been crossed out. The reason was 4 words: disrupting public order. Not one person in the building spoke up for him. Everyone assumed old Joe had offended the building leader. As for Mao Bufan, he kept handing out rations with a smile, as if nothing had happened. I stood in a corner of the lobby watching it all. The feeling that something was wrong became impossible to ignore. Would someone who truly wanted everyone to survive cut off an old man's food just because he asked how much was left? No. Only one kind of person would do that. Someone afraid others might figure out the real numbers. Late that night, everyone in the building was asleep. Only the emergency lights were still on. I went into the hallway to get hot water. As I reached the corner, I heard voices coming from the basement. It was Mao Bufan and 2 of his men. They were speaking very quietly, but the night was so silent that I heard every word. One of them asked, "Are we really cutting old Joe off like that?" Mal Bufon answered flatly. He was crossed off the list long ago. Doing it early won't raise suspicion. The man asked, "What about the list? Should we screen it again?" Mal Bufon paused, then said, "Yes. Within this week. Remove a few more people who aren't on the list. Keep it quiet. Don't let anyone notice." I froze when I heard that. A list. Remove a few more. I pressed against the wall, afraid to move. My heartbeat sounded deafening. So inside this building, besides the public registration sheet, there was another list. A list deciding who received rations and who would quietly be removed. And of the more than 200 residents here, most still had no idea. They worshipped the man writing that list as their savior. I backed away into the stairwell, my back drenched in cold sweat. When I got home, Mum was still awake. She saw my expression and asked what was wrong. I shook my head and said, "Nothing." I told her to go to sleep. I didn't dare tell her what I'd heard. Because I knew that from this day on, everyone in this building, including me, was standing on an invisible list. And I had just placed myself on the opposite side of the man writing it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what Mal Bufon had said. Remove a few more people who aren't on the list. How exactly would those people be removed? Where in the basement was that list hidden? And how many names were written on it? I didn't know. I only knew one thing. On the third day after old Joe was crossed off, he never appeared in the hallways again. Mal Bufon said the basement was dangerous, and no one was allowed down there. But that day I went down. What I saw wasn't danger. It was a sheet of paper. Written on it were the names of every person in our building, divided into two groups. Half the names had circles beside them. The other half had crosses. Old Joe's name was among those marked with a cross. The day after I overheard that conversation, I barely slept at all. All I could think about was that list. I had to see the basement for myself. But that wasn't easy. The basement door was always locked. Only Mal Bufon and his men had the keys. He'd been the property manager for over 10 years, so the building's keys had always been in his hands. During the day, his men took turns guarding downstairs. There was only one opening each day, at noon, when Mal Bufon held a management meeting in the lobby. For that half hour, the basement guard went upstairs to help. Downstairs would be left empty. That half hour was exactly what I was waiting for. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone who could pick a lock. I thought of old Joe, not the elderly Mr. Joe, Master Joe on the 14th floor. Before the disaster, he was a locksmith. Several families in the building had called him to fix their locks. He wasn't much of a talker, but he had one thing going for him. Ever since Mal Bufon took control, he'd never shown Master Joe an ounce of respect. Master Joe had been holding a grudge too. I went to see him. I didn't beat around the bush. "Master Joe, can you open the basement lock?" He stared at me for a long moment and asked, "What are you trying to do?" "I want to see what kind of man we've entrusted our lives to." He was silent for a moment, then turned and picked up his tools. He said one word, "Let's go." The moment the noon meeting bell rang in the lobby, we headed downstairs. Master Joe stood in front of the basement door. His hands worked quickly. In less than 2 minutes, the lock clicked open. I followed him into the basement. It was quiet down there. Only the emergency lights were on, but what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Rows and rows of shelves, stretched from one end to the other. Rice, flour, water, canned food, and medicine were stacked neatly, all the way to the ceiling. I'd worked in emergency management for 7 years. I could estimate the quantity at a glance. Forget 20 days. There was easily enough here for over 200 people to last 2 years. Mal Bufon's claim of 20 days was a lie. The huge amount of supposedly missing supplies hadn't disappeared. It was all right here, untouched. He rationed food using fake numbers. Not because there wasn't enough, but because as long as everyone believed supplies were scarce, they had no choice but to obey him. A chill ran through me. I was about to go farther inside when Master Joe whispered behind me, "Look at that table." There was a desk beside the equipment. A sheet of paper was pinned down on top of it. I walked over. It was a densely filled table of names. Every household from the 1st to the 18th floor was listed on it. Each name had been marked. Half had circles, half had crosses. I found old Joe's name from the 16th floor. A cross was beside it. Next to it were 2 small words, "Removed." Then I looked at the names with circles. Almost all were either young and strong, or people who had voluntarily helped Mal Buffon manage things these past few days. And the crossed out names? The elderly children, people living alone, the sick, and anyone who had asked one question too many in the lobby. Everything suddenly made sense. This paper was a list deciding people's fate. A circle meant stay. A cross meant remove. When Mal Buffon said, "Remove a few more who aren't on the list," he meant the people marked with crosses. He used fake supply numbers to make everyone believe resources were running out, then used this real list to quietly decide who would be forced out first. And more than 200 of us still lined up every day and thanked him. I stared at that sheet of paper, my palms slick with sweat. Just then, Master Joe suddenly grabbed me and whispered, "Someone's coming down." Footsteps sounded from the stairwell. The basement guard had come back early. We hurried into the deepest part of the shelves. He came down and looked around. He didn't notice anything wrong, then went back upstairs. Master Joe and I pressed against the shelves, barely breathing. We waited until the footsteps were completely gone before slowly stepping out. I took one last look at the list and memorized the crossed out names, one by one. Then we quietly went back upstairs, without alerting anyone. Back home, I replayed everything I'd seen, over and over in my mind. There were enough supplies for 2 years. He claimed there were only enough for 20 days. There was a list, dividing the entire building into those who stayed and those crossed out. I had seen all of it with my own eyes. But seeing the truth was one thing. Taking him down was another. Mal Buffon had been this building's property manager for over 10 years. He knew everyone. He had the keys, the food and men loyal to him. And I was just an ordinary resident on the 12th floor. Why would anyone believe me? If I rushed into the lobby now and shouted that Mal Buffon was hiding supplies and keeping a secret list, people wouldn't suddenly wake up to the truth. The only result would be that my name would be in the crossed out column by tomorrow. I thought for a long time that night. Finally, I understood one thing. It wasn't enough for me alone to have seen it. I had to make them see it with their own eyes. The people who had already been marked with crosses, but still had no idea. I brought 5 people into the center of the lobby. All 5 of them were in the crossed out column on that sheet. They just didn't know it yet. I looked at Mal Buffon standing on the steps and finally said what I'd held in for 3 days. Old Joe wasn't causing trouble. Someone had crossed his name off long before that. The entire lobby fell silent. To bring Mal Buffon down. My voice alone wasn't enough. I needed the people he'd crossed off to see that paper themselves. I had memorized the names marked with crosses. I chose 5 people, all neighbors I lived near and could talk to. Auntie Jang, old Joe's longtime neighbor on the 16th floor, a middle-aged couple, and 2 elderly people who lived alone. All 5 names had crosses beside them. I didn't say much. I only told them, "I want to show you something. Look at it first, then decide whether you believe me." At first, no one wanted to move. At a time like this, nobody wanted trouble. Then I asked, "Do you know that someone has already crossed your names off?" They all looked at me the same way. The moment the noon meeting bell rang in the lobby, Master Joe helped us open the basement lock again. I took all 5 of them downstairs. They stood in front of row after row of supplies stacked to the ceiling. Not one of them spoke. I knew exactly what they were thinking. What they were thinking was exactly what I thought the first time I saw the basement. Mal Bufan complained every day that supplies were running out and said there was only enough for 20 days, that the stock here could last 2 years. I led them over to the desk. The sheet of paper was still there. I didn't touch it. I just let them look for themselves. Auntie Jiang leaned closer and searched name by name. Finally, she found her own entry across. Then she looked farther down and found old Joe's name. Beside it were the words, removed. Auntie Jiang's face slowly turned pale. The middle-aged couple found their names too. Both had crosses. They looked at each other. Neither said a word. No one doubted me anymore. At that moment, those 5 people were on my side. We quietly went back upstairs. I told them, when rations are handed out this evening, the lobby will be packed. I'll do the talking. You only need to do one thing. Tell everyone what you saw. That evening, the lobby was packed with people. More than 200 residents filled the room. Mal Bufan stood on the steps as usual, with 2 of his men beside him, smiling as they prepared to hand out rations. I stepped out of the crowd and walked to the center. Mal Bufan saw me. His smile didn't change. Tian Bula, is something wrong? I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but everyone could hear it. Manager Mao, I want to ask you 3 questions in front of everyone. The lobby fell silent. Everyone looked at me. First, you said the basement supplies would only last 20 days. But in reality, there's enough for 2 years. Do you admit that? Mao Bufan's smile faded slightly. You went into the basement. That's a restricted area. Whether I went in isn't important. What's important is whether my numbers are right. I didn't wait for his answer. I immediately asked the second question. Second, you have a list that divides everyone in this building into 2 groups. Half are marked with circles, half are marked with crosses. The crossed names are labeled removed. Old Joe was the first person you removed. Do you admit that? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Mal Bufan's voice turned cold. Tian Bula, you're making baseless accusations. Whether they're baseless isn't for you to decide, and it isn't for me to decide either. Auntie Jiang was the first to step forward. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. I saw it. My name was on that paper in the basement. There was a cross beside it. And old Joe's name said removed. The couple stepped forward next. Both of our names had crosses too. We saw it with our own eyes. 1, 2, then all 5 stepped forward. The lobby erupted. More than 200 people turned toward the steps. The look in their eyes had changed. The mask of a benevolent savior on Mao Bufan's face had been ripped away in public. I looked at him and threw out my third question, word by word. Third, you're just the building manager. What gives you the right to decide which of more than 200 people can stay? And who has to go? That question struck everyone. The people in the lobby went from disbelief to anger. Their voices grew louder and louder as they moved toward the steps. Mal Bufan took half a step back. In the middle of the chaos, I happened to glance toward the edge of the crowd and saw an old man standing there. It was old Kian from the 18th floor. He rarely spoke. Everyone usually respected him and gave him space. The whole building was in an uproar, but he alone stood there expressionless, quietly watching. He didn't say a word. I didn't think much of it then. I thought we'd won. But just then, Mao Bufan suddenly stopped retreating. He straightened up. The panic on his face disappeared. He raised a hand. The lobby gradually went quiet. He looked at me, then at everyone else, and slowly said, "Fine. Everything you said is true. I managed the supplies. I handled the list. But have any of you thought about this? Who is keeping the heat running in this building?" That one sentence was like a bucket of ice water thrown over everyone's anger. Of course, we could stand in this warm lobby and confront him, only because the heating was still on, and the main control switch was deep inside the basement, behind a door that was always locked. He had the key. Only he and his men knew how to open it. Mao Bufan looked around at the people who had just been closing in on him. Then he said, word by word, starting today, if anyone keeps causing trouble, I don't have to hand out rations. Worst case, I'll shut off the heat behind that door. That night, not a single person in the lobby dared make another sound. Not even me, because I knew he wasn't bluffing. Outside, it was minus 40 degrees, but that night, I lay in bed tossing and turning, when I suddenly remembered something. I'd worked in emergency management for 7 years. How many times had I taught emergency heating systems? With a building like this, was the heating system really so specialized that only he could touch it? Or did he simply not want anyone else to know that what was behind that door wasn't actually that difficult? Once that thought appeared, I became strangely calm. He believed the heating system behind that door was his final trump card. What he didn't know was that I might understand that card. Mao Bufan used one locked door to force the entire building to its knees. He said if anyone caused trouble, he'd shut off the heating behind it. Not one of more than 200 people dared speak. But the next morning, I walked alone into the center of the lobby. I said one sentence that made that door useless as a threat forever. I said, I know what's behind that door, and I know how to operate it too. That night, Mao Bufan's threat to shut off the heat silenced the entire building, but I didn't sleep, because I had figured something out. I'd worked in emergency management for 7 years. I knew the underground heating systems in old complexes like this extremely well. It wasn't some precious, mysterious system that only one person could touch. Anyone with the right basic knowledge could operate it. Mao Bufan dared use it as his trump card because he was betting no one else in the building understood it. He bet wrong. But me understanding it wasn't enough. I needed someone to help verify it, and I needed the whole building to believe us. Early the next morning, I went to Master Joe first. Before the disaster, he'd spent half his life fixing locks and machinery. He understood equipment like this even better than I did. I told him what I thought. After listening, he nodded. You're right. That thing behind the door. If the two of us work it out together, we can open it. With those words from Master Joe, I finally felt sure of myself. But I didn't rush to act. I didn't want to secretly take control of the heating. If I did, Mao Bufan could simply say I tampered with the equipment and endangered the entire building. What I wanted was to do it in front of everyone and shatter his lie that only he could operate it. That morning, I asked Master Joe to help me call several sensible, respected residents to gather everyone in the lobby. More than 200 residents assembled again. Mao Bufan came too. He stood on the steps, wearing that same smug smile. He thought I had come to make trouble again, and he still believed the heating was his trump card. I didn't look at him. I spoke to everyone first. Yesterday, Manager Mao said only he could operate the heating. If anyone disobeyed him, he'd shut it off. That's why everyone is afraid. The crowd stayed silent. But let me ask you, what's actually behind that door? Who here has seen it with their own eyes? Who knows what it looks like? Or how to operate it? No one answered. No one, I answered for them. Because for the past 10 days, he's never allowed anyone near that door. He wouldn't let you see it. So you assumed it was mysterious. Something precious that only he could touch. I looked at Mao Bufan. But the heating system in this building is standard equipment installed more than 10 years ago. I've worked in emergency management for 7 years. I know exactly how systems like this are supposed to operate. Is it really that special? Not at all. To operate it, you don't need some unique skill only you possess. You just need basic knowledge. Mao Bufan's smile stiffened. Am I right? You don't have to admit it. I looked at Master Joe beside me. Master Joe has repaired machinery for half his life. He and I examined the system together. We both know what's behind that door and how to operate it. Master Joe raised his voice. She's right. I can operate it too. The atmosphere in the lobby changed instantly. The trump card Mao Bufan had clutched for 10 days became worthless in that moment. So the claim that only he could run the heat had been nothing but a scare tactic from the start. I looked at Mao Bufan and said it plainly. You don't control the lifeline of this entire building. You were just betting that no one understood it. And no one dared look behind that door. Now that card is useless. The crowd's anger flared up again. Even stronger than the day before. Yesterday, they had been afraid. Today, they were furious at being deceived. More than 200 people moved toward the steps again. This time, nothing could suppress them. Mao Bufan stepped back. The smile vanished from his face completely. Sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked at the approaching crowd, then at me. Suddenly, as if he'd been pushed into a corner, he shouted at the top of his lungs. You think I did all of this by myself? The crowd fell silent. I managed the supplies. I handed out the rations. I wrote the names on the list. But on that list, who got a circle and who got a cross? Who was supposed to be removed? The rules weren't mine. I was only carrying out orders. The person really sitting behind the scenes deciding who lives and dies was never me. My mind exploded. Not him? For the past 10 days, the man I'd hated, investigated, and fought to bring down had been Mao Bufan all along. But if he hadn't set the rules for that list, then where was the person who had? I stared at Mao Bufan. Who is it? Tell us. Mao Bufan stood on the steps, his whole body trembling. His gaze passed over the crowd. Slowly, very slowly, until it settled on someone at the edge of the lobby. I followed his gaze. The man was standing outside the crowd, quiet and still. It was old Kian from the 18th floor. The man who usually spoke the least, whom everyone respected and gave way to. Whom everyone thought most deserved care, a kind-looking old man. He met my eyes without the slightest panic. He simply looked at me calmly, exactly as he had the evening before, when the whole building was in chaos, standing there expressionless and watching. Exactly the same. Only then did I understand. I had been watching the wrong person from the very beginning. Among the more than 200 people in our building, there was one man everyone treated with special respect. He was the oldest and spoke the least. People brought him water and gave him their seats. They saved the best things for him. We all believed he was the person in this building who most deserved looking after. Only that day did I learn that the hand dividing every one of our names into stay and remove belonged to him, old Kian. The resident of the 18th floor, Mao Bufan's accusation turned everyone's attention toward him. The lobby became terrifyingly quiet. More than 200 people looked at one another. No one could believe the person who had split the building in two was this old man who barely ever spoke. Old Kian didn't hide. He slowly stepped out from the edge of the crowd. There wasn't a trace of panic on his face. He was as calm as if he were in his own home. I looked at him. Old Kian, is what Mao Bufan said true? Did you set the rules for the list? He looked at me and suddenly smiled. It was a gentle smile, so gentle it made my skin crawl. Then he said, young lady, do you know who I am? I said nothing. This building's underground heating system, and all those supplies below. Where do you think they came from? I personally oversaw their installation more than 10 years ago. Jinghua Garden's first property management company was founded by me. Every pipe in this building, every section of shelving, I could draw from memory with my eyes closed. A low murmur spread through the crowd. He glanced at Mao Bufan. Xiao Mao was personally promoted by me. I gave him his position as property manager. I raised my voice. Then tell everyone, why did you create that list? Why did you cross out the elderly, people living alone, and those in poor health, one by one? For the first time, old Kian's expression changed. It wasn't panic. It was cold, unquestioning certainty, because I did the math. Those supplies may look like enough for 2 years. But what happens after 2 years? What if the deep freeze doesn't end? If everyone keeps consuming together, We'll all consume everything until nothing is left. Instead of letting that happen, it's better to remove the useless people early. Keep the young and able-bodied. And will last longer. That's not cruelty. That's knowing how to calculate. A wave of shocked gasps swept through the lobby. Auntie Jiang trembled with anger. So in your eyes, we're just useless people. Old Qian didn't even look at her. He only looked at the young, strong residents, whose names he had marked with circles. Slowly he said, I chose to keep you, because I think you're worth something. When the deep freeze is over, this building and this property company will have to start up again. When that happens, he looked at Mao Bufan. I promised Zhao Mao a share of the company would be his, and I can give shares to every obedient person here too. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire atmosphere in the lobby changed. At last, I saw the old man for what he really was. In the middle of this deep freeze, everyone else was thinking about how to survive the winter. Only he was calculating what would happen after it ended. The company, those shares, and the power and profit he could reclaim. For those things that might exist after the disaster, he could calmly divide more than 200 lives into those who stayed and those who were crossed out. Mao Bufan had become his knife for the promise of a share, and he treated all of our lives as bargaining chips for reshuffling power after the disaster. I turned to everyone in the building and tore away the last layer of deception. Did everyone hear that clearly? He doesn't want to lead us to survival. He's betting the deep freeze will eventually end, and when it does, he plans to use this building and this company to put himself back on top. To him, the more than 200 people in this building were never human beings. We were capital for his comeback after the disaster. He decided who stayed and who was removed based on whether they were still useful to him. One of them set the rules, and the other acted as the knife. They'd been calculating our lives all the way to the day the freeze ended. The lobby was silent at first. Then it exploded. The fury of more than 200 people was no longer aimed at Mao Bufan alone. Everyone closed in around the steps, toward the old man and the manager. The shouting grew louder. The wall of people pressed forward step by step. The composure on old Qian's face finally cracked. He backed away. Mao Bufan began trembling too. He no longer looked anything like the ruler of the building. No one laid a hand on them. More than 200 people used their voices and their footsteps to force old Qian and Mao Bufan out of the building. Step by step, the two men who had calculated everyone else's fate were finally driven out by the more than 200 residents they'd manipulated, all the way out of Donghua Garden. The last time I saw them was outside in the snow. Old Qian stood there in the storm. In his eyes, there was none of his former composure left. We stared at each other across the snow. I gave him one final sentence. This building was never yours to rule alone. And the fate of more than 200 people here was never yours to decide. Then I turned and went back inside. Behind me was a sky full of wind and snow, and two figures who would never return. They had once crossed other people's names off a sheet of paper. Now they themselves had crossed their own names out of this building. After that day, the building changed. How the heating was operated, how many supplies remained, and how rations were distributed were no longer decided by one person. Master Zhou managed the equipment. Several level-headed residents managed the supplies. If a family ran into trouble, everyone worked together to find a solution. Among the more than 200 people in our building, no one had the right to draw a cross beside someone else's name. The deep freeze still hadn't ended. Outside, it was still minus 40 degrees. Life was still difficult, but the heating in our building stayed on. Every apartment had heat. That night, I stood at the window watching the snowstorm outside. Suddenly I remembered old Qian, turning back to look at me from the snow. There was something in that look he never said aloud. I could guess what it was. He was probably thinking, in this city, ours wasn't the only building with lights still on. And people like him, people who divided others into those who stayed and those crossed out, probably weren't unique either.